My name is Nicole Quadra. I am with San Mateo County Libraries and very excited to be here tonight in conversation with Kristina Cho. Tomorrow night, just a little advert. Please consider joining us at 5 p.m. for Frances Moore Lapay, and who will be discussing her book, Diet for a Small Planet. That book has been reissued. She's going to be in conversation with her daughter, if I'm correct. And that's a very beloved book, and generations of readers have benefited from Frances Moore Lapay's writing. So I encourage you, if you love food and you're here tonight, I encourage you to join us again tomorrow. Your microphone and video are turned off. Please feel free to use the chat and submit your questions in the Zoom chat feature at the bottom of your screen. For those who would like to access live closed captions for this event, click on CC, then show subtitle. Again, those are features at the bottom of your screen as well. And San Mateo County Libraries welcomes Kristina Cho. Kristina Cho is a cookbook author and culinary content creator. Her culinary perspective is rooted in her experience as a first-generation Chinese American growing up in Cleveland with her restaurant family. She now lives in the San Francisco Bay Area, where she's working on her next cookbook and continues to share recipes on her blog, Eat Cho Food. Her newest book, Mooncakes and Milk Bread, is the very first English language book to extensively cover Chinese baking and celebrate the sweet facet of Chinese American culture. I am so glad to be with you here tonight. And I think with that, please, Kristina, take it away.
Cool. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Hi, everybody. I am Kristina Cho. As Nicole mentioned, I am the author of Mooncakes and Milk Bread. It's been out for almost a year now. I was just thinking about how it's coming up on its 1 year book birthday, and it has been a really incredible journey in the almost year that it's been out. It recently won a James Beard Award. Well, technically two. It won 2 James Beard Awards on my wedding day, fun fact. So it's been really heartwarming, and I just feel really grateful that there's been such an amazing response to this book, and I'm really excited to kind of dive deeper into the contents of this book with you, bake one of my favorite recipes from the book. I'm gonna be making the honey pistachio mooncakes because it's almost Mid-Autumn Festival, which is this year on September 10th, so it's coming up, but there's plenty of time to still make mooncakes. And throughout the event, I always like my virtual demos or classes to be very conversational. So feel free to ask me questions during the entire process, whether it's about the actual recipe, or if you just have a general question about the book or Chinese baking or just food in general. I am here to chat with you. I love talking about food. So, okay. And I'm just gonna have the book over here because I used to be really good at remembering every recipe because I was deep into all these recipes, but I'm writing book 2 right now, so I kind of had to allow for more space in my brain to remember. So I have the recipe right here. Okay. So if you ever made mooncakes before, I would love to see that in the chat. I'm always curious to see how many people have actually had experience making mooncakes. I had never made a mooncake up until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. For the longest time, it kind of felt like one of those things that you just left to a professional baker to do, and it's not something that would feel accessible to a home baker or home cook. Even my grandma told me that. She's like, it takes a lifetime to get really great at making mooncakes, which is true, but I do think it is a really great way to kind of dive into Chinese baking. Mooncakes are really traditional in Chinese culture. So that's kind of the half of my title. And the second half is milk bread, which is a little bit more of a contemporary style of baking. So there's kind of that dichotomy of new and more contemporary style of baking in the book. Okay, so there's two parts to mooncakes typically. There's a filling, and then there's also a dough. The dough is a really simple combination of just like flour, oil for fat. Typically, a lot of bakeries use lard, but I find oil a little bit easier to obtain than lard. So we're using that, and then we're going to use some golden syrup. For sweetness, it's also going to kind of like, there's no water in this dough. So the moisture from the golden syrup is also going to provide that hydration. And then a little bit of lye water, also known as alkaline water or potassium carbonate. You can get this at like Asian markets, or you can order it online a lot of times. This is the same thing that you would use in like ramen noodles. Yeah, ramen noodles, wonton wrappers, that gives your dough that like quintessential like chew, and it's going to do the same thing for our mooncake dough. Okay, so, and I'm going to weigh everything that I recommend for every one of the recipes that list the ingredients in grams. You should use a scale for the most accurate results. So most people tend to put a little too much flour in there. Okay. So I'm making a half batch, but I'll speak as if it's a full batch of dough. So you have 300 grams of all-purpose flour, and then you have 110 grams of neutral oil. Okay. And then 160 grams of golden syrup. A lot of people are looking for golden syrup at like their local grocery stores. It might be a little hard to find there, but I know of people who have found it at World Market. If you're in the Bay Area, Berkeley Bowl, or if you're in the East Bay, Berkeley Bowl carries it. That's where I just bought this today. So there's a bunch of different options, or you can of course order it online. Great. And then just a teaspoon of lye water, which is 8 grams. Cool. And then that's it, just like 4 ingredients. I just pour it all into a bowl, and then you're going to use a rubber spatula and just mix it up. There's no kneading in this dough. Think of this dough more like a cookie dough. Like, you don't need cookie dough. You're just going to be mixing it until it reaches like a smooth and like cohesive texture, which will just take like a few turns. Okay. Amazing. You can see that it's looking like a cookie dough. Only took maybe like 20 seconds to reach this consistency. And just give it a good mix, especially at the bottom of the bowl. There could be flour stuck down there, so you just want to make sure everything is well incorporated. Okay, so once you have a nice texture for your dough, you're just going to cover it and let it rest for about 40 minutes. I'm going to do a little shorter for this, which is fine. Also, there's like a good amount of heat and like humidity in the air. But you want to let the dough rest so that the oil has a chance to kind of like permeate the dough. Again, like well hydrated dough. So I'm just going to set this aside. Great. And then while that is resting, we are going to make our filling. You can buy a lot of like different mooncake fillings at like a local Asian grocery store, especially like red bean paste. You can get red bean paste, white lotus paste, black sesame paste a lot of times, but I think that the flavor of a homemade mooncake filling is just like far superior. And in the book, there's a bunch of different styles of mooncakes and also fillings. You kind of like mix and match it. These are Cantonese style mooncakes, the ones that I'm making. And I have 2 options for those. I have the honey pistachio ones, which is what I'm going to be making tonight. And that I designed to be as easy as possible so that everyone feels confident to like kind of get their hands into the mooncake making process. The other option is a red bean paste with salted egg yolk, which is like so classic. One of my favorite flavors. I grew up with my mom and my grandma always getting like the red beans, like multiple egg yolks in there. But that, of course, takes a lot more effort. There's a recipe for homemade salted egg yolks and then also homemade bean paste. If you feel like you're up for it, then you can by all means go that route. But these pistachio mooncakes take like 5 minutes to make the filling, and it's all done in a food processor. So if I have some roasted unsalted pistachios here, if you can find unsalted, that's typically best so that you can control how much salt is going inside your filling. But occasionally, if I'm in a pinch and I can only find like salted pistachios, then that's okay. Just don't add the extra salt in there. And you can always give your filling a taste. If it feels like extra salty, you can kind of balance it out with like maybe adding a little bit more honey in there just to balance everything out. So, and I have my food processor on the side, but I'm just going to combine everything into this bowl. So you have 200 grams of roasted unsalted pistachios, and then I'm going to add some coconut oil. What the coconut oil is going to do in here is a fat that stays solid at like room temperature. But I like it better than like butter, just because of the flavor, and I like the texture that it gives the filling. It also helps everything like bind together. So we are going to add a tablespoon. Let me get a different spoon. So a tablespoon is, oh, sorry, 2 tablespoons, 25 grams. Perfect. Okay. And then we're going to add our salt, just half a teaspoon, sorry, a teaspoon of salt. These are on the salt. I know I just said that you don't want it to be too salty, but these are on the saltier side because I really like a sweet and salty dessert. My mom is like obsessed with these. I kind of made them for her, and she always describes them as just kind of like it tastes like a chocolate bar or like a candy bar, but without like the excess like caramel and chocolate in there. Okay, and then we're gonna add some honey for sweetness, and then it's also going to bind everything together. So a quarter cup, 80 grams. We use lots of my honey here. And I like to use honey. You can also even use like the golden syrup here because it's like very viscous. Depending, some people like to substitute it or can substitute it with like maple syrup. But it just depends on the kind of maple syrup you have. If you have a really thick maple syrup, I think that's great. But a lot of times a maple syrup can be a little bit loose. And I think that makes your filling like a little bit more difficult to work with. So I use the last of my honey, so I'm just gonna add a little bit more golden syrup. Great. Okay, and then lastly, we're gonna add some cornstarch. Also going to help bind everything together. Add a tablespoon cornstarch. Have you read any mooncake questions so far?
Not yet. I think people are
okay, happily watching. Okay, cool. All right, so then I'm gonna put this into a food processor, and this is gonna do like all of the work for us. So I don't have a cordless food processor, so it's just off on the side. So I'm gonna pulse the filling a few times. You don't want to pulse it too much because then you're gonna make pistachio butter. You want the consistency to be like, there should be some parts that kind of feel like creamy, but you still want like kind of like small pebble size of the pistachio just for texture. It'll just be seconds. So I'm gonna do that over here. Probably less than 30 seconds.
There's a question, Kristina, about using other nuts.
Yeah, you can use a lot of different varieties. Especially, I know that pistachios are a little bit more expensive and luxurious, but it kind of fits the mood of Mid-Autumn Festival. But I've made a very similar filling with peanuts. Like if you can imagine like a honey, like a salty honey peanut filling would be really good. I really wanted to, if I had more time, I really wanted to make like a pecan pie flavored mooncake with like roasted pecans and maybe a little like orange zest and like cinnamon in there. So I think that nuts are the easiest base for a mooncake filling because they have a great texture and they're also very solid. The success of a mooncake really starts with the filling. If you have a filling that's like too soft and mushy, it's going to make the process of assembling them and pressing them like really difficult. So nuts are just the easiest if it's your first time making mooncake. So pumpkin seeds is great too. Okay, so if you guys can see this, that is the texture of my filling. You can see how there's still like texture to it. But if you scoop a little bit, like that, I'm just gonna make a little ball. But you should be able to scoop it, press it into a little ball, and it like mostly stays together. It's okay if a few pieces like kind of crumble to the wayside, but it should hold together. So that's it for our filling. I actually made a batch of this earlier today when it was really, really hot out, and the coconut oil was like melting a little bit, which made the filling a little harder to form. And so if you're making mooncakes in a really hot area or your kitchen's just like a little bit warm and it feels loose, you can just stick it in the fridge or even the freezer to kind of speed it up a little bit just to allow the filling to firm up. I do that with the red bean paste filling. Like everything's just easier when it's cold. So I'm just gonna wash my hands real quick. Okay. And now I am going to, I like to do everything like assembly line style. So I'm going to portion out my dough and then I'm also going to portion out my filling. So all of that is ready. And then I'm going to start the wrapping process. So for the dough, you can kind of eyeball it if you wanted to, just like grab a scoop. Or if you want to be really exact, you can weigh your dough and then divide it by 6 or 12, like whatever you're doing. So a little ball here. And I can tell, like, even though it's only been resting for maybe like 10 minutes or so, it's a lot more hydrated and malleable. So I'll bring this a little closer, but your dough should feel like soft and pliable, just like that. I've gotten messages from people saying like, what's wrong with my dough? It's crumbly. And crumbly is definitely not what you're looking for. But my first question is always like, are you weighing your ingredients? If you have too much flour, it'll be crumbly. So if you're making this and it's not this kind of like Play-Doh smooth consistency, try adding a little bit more oil or probably golden syrup would be a little bit more helpful. So it has that hydrating property, but just add a little bit more of that and see if you can reach this texture. So I have a ball out. And I'm just gonna eyeball it. I've gotten pretty good at portioning these out by sight over the last few years. Okay. A little bit of background behind Mooncake. So I mentioned before that it's Mooncake season because Mid-Autumn Festival is a few days away. But Mid-Autumn Festival is a Chinese and other Asian cultures also celebrate it too, but it's a holiday to kind of celebrate like the end of like summer harvest and like move on to the fall. There's a full moon that night. My family, when we were going to celebrate Mid-Autumn Festival, we would typically celebrate it on Mid-Autumn Eve. Some families do it on the day or on the eve, but we would do it on the eve. And we would go to my grandparents' house and have a big dinner. There would be a platter of mooncakes that all different types of fillings that would be cut into little wedges. I recently saw a video of someone biting biting into like a really big mooncake, and it was like one of the strangest things I've ever seen, because you're only supposed to cut them up into like wedges. But that's just like how you eat them. It's about the practice of, or the ritual of sharing with each other. Mooncakes are typically round, although they come in different shapes, like square or like animal shapes and flower shapes, but you have to cut them into wedges. Take a little bite. You can take multiple bites if you want more mooncake, but the holiday is all about sharing. Okay. More. Oh, and then another thing we did during Mid-Autumn Festival, I remember, is that like at the end of dinner, my grandma would give everyone like a little baby taro, which is kind of like a potato. And it looks like a moon because it kind of has like craters on the outside, but everyone would get like a little taro, and we would go out into her garden, because she was like she came from like a farming family, but we would all eat our taro in the garden while like looking up at the moon together. I have not heard of anyone else doing that. If you grew up with a similar tradition, please let me know, but that's just like a sweet memory I have of Mid-Autumn Festival. Cool. So I have 6 dough balls, and then I'm gonna use let's see. So these come in handy for like everything. It's just like an ice cream scoop, or they're called dishers. This is a 1.5 tablespoon size, and I use this literally all the time for like mooncakes, and then making stuffed buns or dumplings or meatballs. Like, I love this thing. So, all right. And then my hands are a little oily still from like working with the dough, which is great, because then it allows me to like roll up the pistachio filling. You want to give it like a little press so that it's solid. And then a little bit sticks to my hand, but it's not really a big deal. So I got 1. 2, and then I'll do 1 more. You can taste this filling. This is when you would taste it to see if you need to like add a little bit more honey, or even like a little bit more salt if you find it necessary. Okay. I'm just going to wash my hands really quick, and then we are going to assemble and press our mooncakes. The really fun part. So we're going to start by grabbing a dough ball, and I'll do this a few times. I'll move the camera a little closer for the next round so you can kind of get a little bit more detail. But I've just started just using my palm to flatten out the dough. You can also use a rolling pin. That's what I write in the instructions, but you want to like press the dough out, flatten it, try your best to keep it in like a circle formation. And then let me get, so a dough scraper. So you're not going to be able to just peel off the dough like without the assistance of a dough scraper. So you want to take this and just kind of like shimmy it under. If you don't have a dough scraper, you can also use like a wide blade knife like this or this, just to get under there. Just be careful though, because those are sharp. Okay, then you have your dough wrapper. I'm gonna put it in my non-dominant hand, and then I'm gonna put the filling in here, and then roll or fold up the dough up and around the filling. So this is when having a really sturdy filling comes in handy, because it just makes the wrapping process so much easier. You can imagine if it's really soft and squishy, it's going to kind of like collapse in on itself. So I'm just going to roll it to a smooth ball like that. And then this is the mooncake mold that I have. So I have a round mooncake mold, and then a square one. This one's 75 grams, so you can adjust your filling based on like the size of the mold that you have. As long as it fits in there, it's fine. Even if it's really tight, you can still use, like, it's totally maxed out, you can still do it, press down, and any excess dough you kind of just scrape off and have it on reserve. So, okay. So, and you can see here, there is a impression, and you can swap this out. There's like a mechanism on the back here that if you twist it, it allows you to take off this design and then put another one. You can buy this at like an Asian home goods store, like you go to Chinatown or the various little Chinatowns in San Francisco, or you can order this off Amazon or Etsy. Just pick the design that you like best. Okay, so I'm going to place this in here. I find the round mooncake molds are just overall easier to use because it's the same shape as your dough ball. I recently got like a flower shaped one, and as pretty as it is, like the parts or the points where the petals come in tend to kind of like cut into my dough ball. So that's just something to be mindful of. So, okay. And then you're going to use this plunger. So I have my left hand just kind of like holding the overall press down. And then I'm going to take my right hand and press down on the plunger and apply like a good amount of pressure. And then when you feel like it's not going to move anymore, you want to let up, to pop up. Okay, and the mooncake's still stuck in there, which is fine, but it should just kind of like plop out like that. And so I don't flour my work surface, or like I don't use any extra flour anymore. It's one of those things, like I mentioned, like I didn't use a rolling pin. The more you make mooncakes, the more comfortable you get in the process. And you start to figure out things that like work for you. But in the recipe, I do tell people to kind of dust their work surface with a little bit of flour just to make things easier. So just like get comfortable with it. You'll start to find your own way to make mooncakes. Okay, so I'm going to just put this on a baking sheet lined with parchment paper. Okay, and that's one. Let me move the camera so that you can get like, when I used to teach dumpling classes, I called it dumpling cam. So this is just mooncake cam, I guess. We can get like really up in there. Okay. So I'm going to take a piece of dough, flatten it either with your palm or a rolling pin. And let me press this filling back together. Okay. And fold the edges up and over. Try to apply some pressure so you don't get any like air pockets. Okay, you see here how you kind of have like a lot of extra dough. Like if that happens, you can just pull it off. Like you don't really need it. As long as the dough, or as long as the filling is completely covered, you're good. Okay, so filling and dough all wrapped up. And take my press, stick the dough ball in there. Apply pressure, let up, still stuck in there. And then, and the reason why everything kind of loosens because like there is oil on the dough. And so when you have like a well-made dough, that oil is just going to create this like non-stick surface on everything. Ta-da! That's the most satisfying part, is when it just like releases. Okay.
It looks so beautiful, Kristina.
Thank you. So I'm just gonna make the rest of them. I have like 4 more to make, but if anyone has any questions about anything, this would be a great time to ask them.
You can put your questions for Kristina in the chat. There is a question about taro. I think you must have mentioned taro, but I know that you're not using it right now, but is the taro raw or cooked? There's that question.
Oh, okay. You definitely want to cook taro. Raw taro is actually like, I don't know if the right word is toxic, but if you eat raw taro, like it's gonna like make your mouth like a little like scratchy. So you definitely want to cook it. I've made taro paste. There actually is a taro bun in the book. So you can use that paste filling for the mooncakes. I actually forgot about that. There's so many recipes. But there's this kind of like mix and match kind of opportunity in the book because like so many of the buns are just a combination of like outer layer of bun, a very different bread, and then a different filling. And so you can kind of like mix and match to create different things. So while there isn't like a taro mooncake in here, there is taro paste and there's like various taro like exteriors. So you can just make it yourself.
Experiment.
Yeah.
While you're making the last four, there have been a couple of questions about book number 2. So there's some curiosity about it if you want to sort of maybe do it.
I am in the process of writing it right now. If everything goes according to plan, like it should be out in the fall of next year, but it might take a little longer. I don't know. It's all hanging in the balance right now. But the earliest it'll be out will be the fall of next year. It's not a baking book, but there is a dessert chapter. I haven't released the title yet, but it's about family style cooking, inspired by the way that I grew up eating with my family. I grew up in like a restaurant family, so there was always just like a lot of people around to eat big quantities of stuff. And so it's kind of inspired by that, but also still taking influence of like, I live in California now, and like the family that I have, or the chosen family that I have here, and just it's filled with recipes that are great for just feeding people when they come over.
That's awesome.
There's a lot of savory cooking.
So I noticed that some are thicker, I think, than others. Does that impact your mooncakes? Does that impact baking?
This one really. It's like a little bit, but it doesn't really impact the baking so much. So like the filling, it doesn't really need to be cooked. The filling, because it's just nuts. So and that goes for like most mooncakes. And so the baking process is really about our dough, and it's a two-part baking process. So you like bake it for 10 minutes first with no egg wash, just set it in the oven just to set the crust in place. And then after 10 minutes, you take it out, let it cool for a few minutes, and then apply like a really light egg wash for color and also sheen. And then you set it in for another 10 minutes. So it's really just giving your dough enough time to like fully cook. Okay, almost there.
I think you mentioned it, but somebody asked where you got your press, your mold. And I don't know.
I got this from Amazon many years ago. The same mold like no longer exists, or the listing isn't there, but I recently ordered one from my mom on there just based on like patterns. So I was just trying to find like the pattern, or I wanted to find like a mold that had like a very similar pattern to the one that I had because she really liked it. So Amazon's a great place if you like ordering from Amazon, but Etsy has a ton of like really fun different kinds of designs. So, and this is a plunger or plastic plunger style mooncake mold. It's like a newer version of a mooncake press. Of course, they weren't using this like thousands of years ago when they were making mooncakes. The more traditional or like old style mooncakes are made out of wood, which I actually do have one. But I don't use it that often because just like it's a little harder to use. Your mooncakes don't come out as like pristine as I like them to be, because so you imagine it's like a wooden paddle, and sometimes I think there's like 2 to 3 different voids in there where you stick like your mooncake into and you press it in, but then you have to knock it against the counter and like to release them, so like it just takes effort to like kind of get the hang of that like whack to like get your mooncakes out. And so in the book I said that you can still use those, but I highly recommend the plastic style ones because they're just like overall just like so much easier to use. All right.
That sounds like, like it would require a learning curve, right? To get
Yeah.
the backing right.
I think next year I might try to give my wooden mooncake mold like a little bit more love. But when life gets crazy, you want to go with like the easiest option that still creates like a really wonderful product. So
is it in your kitchen? Is it within arm's reach to show us?
it's in let me finish making this, but I'll grab it. It's in like our back, like my overflow kitchen area. But I can grab one. Okay. So, well, I fit five fit here, so I'll just stop at 5. Okay, one more time. Okay.
Lovely.
Cool. Yay. Okay, so we got a full tray. I'm gonna wash my hands real quick. That was surprisingly quick. So we have a full tray of mooncakes here. So they don't grow necessarily, like it's not like cookies that spread or puff up too much. And so they can be close together, but like you just don't want to be touching. I generally like to allow anything that I'm baking to have a little bit of like space so that like they can bake evenly, have airflow around it. But once you have all your mooncakes pressed and ready to go, you want to bake it in a 350-degree oven. I kind of talked about it a little bit earlier, but the first bake is just 10 minutes. Set the crust, take it out, allow it to cool for a few minutes because we're going to brush on an egg wash. If you brush on the egg wash while these are like hot out of the oven, it's going to like kind of cook your egg wash a little bit. So you don't want that. So that's why you want to give it a few minutes to cool down. And then I have really thin egg wash. So it's just having a little jar like this. So I have 1 large egg with 2 tablespoons of water. So it's on the lighter or like the looser end of egg washes because you don't want to gunk up your pattern too much. So I like to use a natural bristle brush. You can also use silicone, but I like to use natural because I think it applies the egg wash in a more even and like lighter way. But if you feel like you put on a little bit too much egg wash on here, you can grab like a paper towel, like fold it up and just kind of dab it where you find like the eggy parts. Because too much egg on there is just going to make the pattern that you've like worked so hard to like create a really good impression. It's just going to like fill it up and you won't get like as clean of a pattern. So then the egg wash, put them back in the oven for 10 more minutes and then they are done. Then you just want to let them cool. So just like TV magic, I already have some baked already. Although like this went by a lot faster. So like I probably could have baked them and had them done by the time the end of class. But so I baked these earlier. Let me see if I can get them a little closer. Okay. So I baked these earlier. They're pretty like sturdy. So mooncakes are typically like a sturdy biscuit, sturdy cookie. After they come out of the oven, this design will initially look like a little puffy or a little cloudy. But if you let it cool, like you'll see a difference even in the first 30 minutes of cooling, that you're going to see the pattern start to kind of like define a little bit more. And especially if you let them rest in like a container, like a Tupperware box or something like that, or a tin. If you let them rest for a day or two, what's happening is like the fat and the oil from the dough is like evenly dispersing itself like within the mooncake, making the pattern like even more clean. So there's a step at the end that says like, let your mooncakes rest in an airtight container for like 1 to 2 days. And a lot of people are like, like I just want to eat a mooncake right now. But that's really just for like the full effect of a mooncake. I always eat one of these pistachio mooncakes fresh because they're just so good. So don't feel like you can't like enjoy a single mooncake once they're out of the oven. They're still really delicious. They just like, get more of like the classic texture.
Kristina, somebody asked if you would cut a mooncake in half to sort of see the cross section.
Yeah, I was just about to do that. Let's see. I think this one's fine.
And actually, can you move the press because it is okay. Oh, nice.
Sorry, it's a little dark, but hold on a second. Does that help a little bit?
It looks amazing.
Yeah, it's sorry, it's a little dark. Well, it's nighttime now, but yeah, it has a really nice even distribution of crust to filling. If you can get really nice pistachios, then you can get like a really great green color on the inside. I think there's some green in here, but I might have roasted them like an extra minute or two longer. My mom actually just made these today, and she sent me a cross sections of hers, and her pistachios are like really nice and green, and they're just like beautiful. So I'm gonna cut like a wedge, and what do you want? They're great. It was like a wonderful like sweet pistachio cookie.
Lovely.
So
okay, we're all getting hungry for mooncakes over in our respective homes.
Yeah, and if you don't want to bake them, the beauty of living in the Bay Area is that there's so many like Chinese bakeries, Asian grocery stores that also sell them, so you can also enjoy them that way.
Lovely. So if people have questions about mooncakes, please put them in the chat. But there is a question about milk bread.
Mm-hmm.
So any tips on making milk bread? I tried out the recipe in the cookbook, but my bread came out a bit dense.
Okay, so milk bread is the second half of my cookbook title. It's like a foundational recipe. I think the recipe is like very forgiving, but it does, just like with mooncakes and a lot of things with baking, the more you do it, the more you get to know your bread and how it handles, because everyone's house is different, the temperatures and everything like that. And that's really important for making dough. So the main things I ask people if like they come out with like kind of dense bread is like, one, did you weigh your ingredients? You really want to make sure that you weigh everything. Too much flour will make it kind of dense. But then the main thing is giving it proper time to truly double. Milk bread is a enriched dough, meaning that there's a lot of like kind of like fatty things in there. Like there's milk, there's butter, and there's eggs. And the more enriched your dough is, the slower it's going to rise, because it's just kind of like weighing it down a little bit. And then another thing about the recipe is that it actually has a fairly low yeast content. In the recipe, there's 1 teaspoon of yeast for a loaf of bread. And if I'm being honest, I would actually go lower than that. I've made it with just half a teaspoon of yeast before, and it has amazing results. It's something I learned from my husband, who is really wonderful at like making pizza dough, like really great at making bread too. Like less yeast equals better flavor in your bread. And so all those reasons, like you just want to allow your bread proper time to truly double. If you're like in the Bay Area, the temperature swings can be so crazy. And like if I made milk bread today, it probably would have taken like an hour to truly double. But if I was making it in like January or something, it could take over 3 hours. And so that's just something to be mindful of with your rising. And those are kind of, I think those are probably the main things that would contribute to a dense bread. It's just like weighing everything correctly and giving enough time to rise.
Okay. So definitely invest in a scale.
Yeah. It's so they're so cheap. Like I think I got mine for like $20 or something
somewhere. I think the same person who asked that you cut your mooncake in and show us the cross section is asking about the ratio of dough to filling. So more filling, but is there weight in grams ratio for the?
So it really just depends on your skill level and the size of mooncake you're making. So in the recipe, in the mooncake recipes for like the canteen style, the filling is like pretty close to 50-50 of dough to filling, but it's that way because it's the easiest for a beginner mooncake maker. I had like a huge range of like various experience levels of bakers try out the mooncake recipes, And people who are like very comfortable making different doughs and stuff like that were able to like do a thinner layer of dough on the outside. But then people who are like, I don't know how to bake. It was just really hard to make like a thin layer. And so having a slightly thicker layer of dough will just make the overall process a lot easier. But then it goes into like a preference question too. So I was making mooncakes with my mom 2 weeks ago, and her favorite part of the mooncake is the dough. Like there's a style of mooncake, and I write a little bit about it in the book. It's just dough. Like growing up in Hong Kong, she loved like the plain mooncakes that were just dough, and they were formed into like little pigs and different like animal shapes. And so I wrote about that in the book. So if you're someone like my mom that really likes like the cookie dough more than the filling, then like by all means make that ratio heavier. So it's really up to you.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. There's a little bit of chat about like, measuring by weight or using measuring cups and stuff like that. I also, like during the pandemic and I was doing a lot of baking at home, I also finally purchased a scale and I love it too.
Yeah, I generally like, if a recipe has the gram measurements for you, use it. Like the baker, whoever wrote that recipe, like went so far to get that detailed with you. And so if it's there, use it. I think there's a lot of different like benefits to baking with a scale. The most important thing is like the most accurate way of baking. The clearest example is that like everyone measures flour a little differently. Like when I measure flour, I get 125 grams in 1 cup of flour, but someone else could measure it and like pack too much in there. Like you shouldn't pack your flour into a cup, and someone else could get 150 grams. And so if a recipe calls for 2 to 3 cups of flour, it's gonna build up, and your dough or whatever you're making might be dry or crumbly. I also think it allows for less things to clean. I currently live without a dishwasher, so like efficiency and like less things to wash or standing over my sink for is really important to me. And so if you're just weighing everything, you're just kind of just like what I did before. I was just dumping everything into the bowl. I didn't have a ton of like measuring spoons and stuff. So that's also another benefit.
Okay. There's a nice comment here, and I think that'll lead into some additional questions, but it says that Mooncakes and Milk Bread was previously chosen for the Food 52 Baking Club. The importance of representation was highlighted and how people felt seen by trying out your recipes. So that person, that's Lindsay, and she thanks you for publishing this cookbook, sorry, Lindsay, publishing. And there are, some questions about, sort of, I think just more general about Chinese baking. So you describe that Chinese baking generally aims to be not too sweet, quote, not too sweet. How does that influence your recipes?
Yeah. Thank you, Lindsay, for that really kind message. You are exactly the person that I wrote this book for. I wrote the book for a lot of imaginary people in my mind, and it was especially for the people who like probably grew up enjoying these Chinese baked goods, going to these bakeries and never seeing this style or the food that like your family loves so much represented in any way. When I was growing up, I never saw it represented like on a Food Network show or in a magazine or anything like that. Like maybe a few websites had like a recipe on there. Like I started sharing recipes on my blog for it because of that void, and that's why I wrote the book. And I think it's really amazing that so many people have been so interested in Chinese baking and frequenting Chinese bakeries more. It's hard to like fully describe what a Chinese bakery it is. Or the style of Chinese bakery that I primarily focus on in my book is based on like the Hong Kong style of Chinese baking, which there's a lot in the Bay Area. Bakeries typically have like plastic or like glass cases filled with like different buns and pastries, and you get like a cafeteria tray and some tongs and just like load it up with your favorite things. And it has the most unique it has the most unique flavor combinations, like really beautiful like sweetness levels that like rely on like fruit and things, like never anything cloyingly sweet. Um, um, and what's interesting is that to describe Chinese baking, like we call it Chinese baking, but when I asked my dad about it, he actually calls it like Western style baking in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong has such like a interesting mix of like Asian influence and then also like European influence. And so like milk bread, for example, is like very similar to like a brioche or like a challah, or like egg tarts have like a puff pastry crust, you know? So Chinese baking isn't something that's completely foreign to the average person. You find familiarity in a lot of different kinds of recipes. And I think that that's something that makes Chinese baking very special.
Tell us about including the profiles of Chinese bakeries in
Yeah,
your book.
it was really important for me to include that. And like before, so I started writing the book like just before the pandemic, like January 2020. And my publisher really wanted me to like go out on the road to like interview and like just go to these different bakeries. And so I was actually gonna travel with my mom to go to different bakeries with me, because she also loves them too. My Cantonese, I don't even speak Mandarin, but like my Cantonese is like a little rusty, and I wanted like very good interviews, like for them to feel comfortable. So I was like, Mom, can you come with me? You love talking to everybody. And so we were planning to just go to these different bakeries across America. But then the pandemic happened and couldn't travel anymore. And so after a few months, I just reached out to a bunch of different bakeries, like through email or just connections through people, and just asking if they can just like speak to me and tell me about their story. It was really important for me to include features or backgrounds about different Chinese bakeries in different Chinatowns across America to kind of like give more context to Chinese baking, and to also give more gravity to it. Like for people who did not grow up with Chinese baking, grow up with Chinese bakeries, to know that these are very special places to people who grew up in these Chinatowns. It's not like a new style of baking that people are just starting to do. Like these bakeries have been around for like decades. Like the bakery in San Francisco Chinatown, like Eastern Bakery, is like over 100 years old. And so I wanted to be able to tell those stories in a real like open and honest way, just to add more humanity and dimension to the book.
How have Chinese bakeries adapted because of the different available ingredients and tastes also in this country, or maybe specifically California?
Yeah, I could probably speak a little bit more into it in the context of like California, where I grew up in Cleveland. Like we didn't have a Chinese bakery for the longest time. They have one Chinese bakery now that like opened like right before I left for high school. So I didn't really grow up going to it too much, but it's great. But in California, I think we're so lucky to have like Shenki, and like, which is kind of like a bigger one. Like they have so many different locations, and then like all of like the smaller like mom and pop bakeries. And I think that they tend to kind of like experiment with what flavors are trending or like becoming more popular. Like you see like a lot of like matcha or like hojicha, like jasmine flavor. I don't know, just like kind of like the newer flavors that you might not typically see at like an old style bakery in like Hong Kong or something like that. And even in the Bay Area, like I know of 2 bakeries in Oakland that opened in like the last couple years that are kind of like a new style of Chinese bakery, where they're like making like char siu croissants. And like things like that. And I think that's really exciting to see more of that in the Bay Area, and hopefully throughout the rest of the country.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah.
In your cookbook, there are pictures from your wedding. There are photos from your wedding. So I wanted to ask how, do events like that inspire your recipes or your baking?
Yeah. So just to clarify, there are not, or sorry, did you say that there are wedding photos in my book, or?
Oh, sorry, on your blog.
Okay, yeah, sorry. Yeah. So I only got married, I got married this past June. But
Okay.
yeah, there are not they might be in the second one, but there are not wedding photos in the book, but I definitely like I'm a very sentimental person and I find inspiration in everything that connects with me. So definitely like life moments, like life events
Yeah.
are amazing kind of like idea sparks for me. Just going back to like my wedding, like for the second book, I'm working on this like icebox cake that's inspired by the flavors of my wedding cake. So as just a way of storytelling, like I that's how I I write recipes. I find it I think it's like the architect in me. Like I studied architecture. I used to work in architecture before doing this full time. And I feel like that training, like as an architect, like it's so hard to do anything, like any design change or whatever without reason. And so when I write recipes, I can't just like write a recipe because or at least for my books, I have a hard time writing a recipe just because like, oh, I think this would be cool. Or I think this would be trendy for whatever reason. Like every recipe in Mooncakes and Milk Bread and in my second book tells a story or shows a technique, allows people to expand on like definitions that they of baking or flavors that they might not have thought of before. So everything has a reason. And it makes my job harder. Like I wish I was like maybe like another cookbook author that didn't need to have that for every single recipe, but that's at least my approach to writing.
Thank you so much. This has been delightful, a real pleasure. It's 7:59 and I promised to wrap up on time. Someone's asked a couple times if you used to cook at or teach cooking at Draeger's.
I did.
Yeah,
I did.
okay.
I think I maybe taught like maybe 2 or 3 classes before the pandemic. Like I was going to teach more and then the pandemic happened. So.
Okay. Well, thank you again so much. Thank you everyone for attending. Please check out our San Mateo County Library's upcoming author talks at smcl.org/author talks. We would also appreciate it if you could tell us how we did with this program at smcl.org/rate this event. And I think there's going to be some links in the chat or soon. And so I mentioned the additional giveaway copies, hopefully available later this week. We're standing by to receive them. And we'll send an email out to everyone who registered when they arrive and we're ready to distribute them. So everybody, let us know how we did. The link is in the chat. And have a great night. Thank you, Kristina Cho. I just wish I had a mooncake in front of me right now.
I know. I wish I could share these. I wish I could
all
share
I really
them.
want.